All right. Well, welcome to Intro to Bird Photography Part 1. I know a lot of you were asking for suggestions about photography, camera selection, and how to take pictures and everything. And I thought I'd put this together so we could talk about that and kind of get an idea of what everybody wants to know, wants to learn about. Maybe push them in one direction or another if you are on the fence about whether you want to take the plunge and get into it more aggressively, or maybe if it's not for you. So we're going to talk about that. I know personally, I kind of came to birding through photography. I wasn't a birder when I got my first camera. I was more of a generalized nature enthusiast, and I had taken a picture of a rhino at a zoo with a friend's DSLR, and it made me feel like a kid because it was a photo that I always would see and wish I could take myself. And I ended up later that year getting my first DSLR, which was a Nikon D40. And I got a zoom lens, and I started wandering around in the woods and taking pictures of anything I could find. And birds were the most varied subject I could find. There was a lot of them around, some of them more photogenic than others or cooperative than others. And I would go first thing in the morning to Kensington and photograph the cranes and the deer. And from there, it just kind of took off. And that was about 10 years ago now that I started doing that. So there's two ways you can kind of go about using a camera. Is you can go birding with the camera, which is just kind of wandering around, seeing what you find. You can use it for documenting. It's really great if you don't really know every bird that you see and you don't want to spend a lot of time thumbing through a field guide. You can take a photo of a bird and then I assess the ID later. It's great for learning shorebirds, for example. That's how I spend a lot of time going over the nuances of shorebirds and fall warblers and things like that that aren't super obvious. I would take a picture and not really worry about it in the field and not stress myself out and go back, and then it started to improve my my field skill as well. It's also great if you have warblers bouncing around up on the top of the trees against a bright sky. You can kind of overexpose them and reveal detail you can't get with binoculars. If you find a rarity, a lot of times they won't accept it or believe you if you don't have a photo, or if you just want to say, hey, I got a picture of that rare bird. It's always good to have on hand. And it can really add another level of enjoyment to your birding if you kind of come back with something to show for it, and you can enjoy the birds after you've left the hot spot that you're at. For me, I like to approach birding with as many ways to have a good time as possible. So if I'm creating a checklist and I see a lot of birds but don't get a good photo, I get some enjoyment out of that. Conversely, if I take a good photo and don't see a lot of species, that's also great, and you can kind of get added enjoyment from common species that you're familiar with. If you get a close encounter with them, you get a nice photo and some good light, it can make you more interested in birds that you might disregard otherwise. So this is one that if you weren't sure about the difference between greater and lesser yellowlegs, you could snap a photo like this and not really worry about identifying it in the field. Just look at that bill length back on your computer when you get home, and work out those differences that way. It's a lot of fun to do it that way, and you can kind of push through and add another level of detail that might not be able to observe in the field. Now, if you want to get into bird photography specifically, it's a little bit of a different ballgame. There's still elements of birding with the camera that I think everybody in this group particularly takes part in, but for bird photography, you might specifically target a certain group or certain species that you want to add to your portfolio. So maybe you just go out and shoot hooded warblers one day, or you want a good photo of great blue herons building a nest. There are things that you go out and you more focused on getting the shot than you are going and seeing a lot of species or hitting a bunch of locations. So you might just have one target in mind. You go and spend some time with that bird, and then you're done for the day. In my opinion, you don't have as much good light if you're really seriously into photography. Generally speaking, the best light is early or late in the day, and if it's sunny and you're in midday, you get real harsh light, and that isn't always the best for a great photo. So sometimes you might not get the photo you want, so you would go back, even though you saw the bird, go back and get a better look at it, better photo, so that there's a little bit more diligence that you got to put in. You got to wake up earlier sometimes, and it's frighteningly addictive. It's a slippery slope that can take up a lot of your time, a lot of your disposable income if you're not careful. But it's very rewarding. And the one thing I wanted to stress to you guys is I heard a lot of like, oh man, I can't take a picture like that. I've never been able to. If you want to learn how to take good pictures of birds, you can. It's not some sort of innate ability for most people. It's just like learning to use any tool. So if you really like taking pictures and it's appealing to you and you get a little bit of enjoyment out of capturing a good photo, you can learn the technical abilities and the composition rules and all that good stuff. It's easy, you know, you got to stick with it, and it takes a little bit of time, but it's not something that is a yes or no, do you have the talent for that? Because in my opinion, most people, if they really enjoy it, can learn to be a good bird photographer. So it's just a matter of how much you want to. If it's not something that is super interesting to you, then, you know, that'll probably cap out your skill level that way. So this is kind of one of the first style of photos that I took was portraits of sandhill cranes at Kensington Metro Park. They let you get very close, and you can do these fun portraits where you get some detail, nice reflections in the eyes, and see what's going on with their bill. You can, you know, see how much they've been probing in the mud or cleaning their feathers. And there's a lot of fun stuff that you can learn about birds by taking photos of them, like the texture and that red part of their head. For me, was something that I didn't realize wasn't feathers. It didn't really track with me that was skin until I got a nice photo and was able to go in and really examine what was going on with the birds. So there's a lot that you can learn about the anatomy of a bird by having a good photo to work on too. So there's, like I said, a lot of benefits to having that reference for your birding. So to decide whether you want to be a birder with a camera or a bird photographer, just think about, and you don't have to commit to any of this stuff, but what is your goal? What are your priorities? So are you just looking to document the species you see on a daily basis? Are you looking to create some prints for your home that you hang up, you know, in your living room to show off, you know, I was out birding and I got a Williamson's sapsucker, or, you know, something like that. You know, do you want to create a coffee table book? Are you serious and you want to win an award in a magazine for photography and get your work posted on Audubon or Nat Geo or something like that? Are you just looking to study the details of the bird, like I said, you know, looking at wing bars and, you know, tertial alignment on gulls or something like that? Or do you want to do this professionally? Is it something you'd like to lead, you know, photography tours in the field? So depending on what of those appeal to you, that can give you an idea how serious you want to be with it. And there's all, you know, measures in between that you can choose from as well. You know, myself, I'm not particularly, you know, serious about it in the way some people are out there every morning taking photos. I try to get out as much as I can, but I'm far away from some of these professional photographers that get out there and lead groups and spend every free chance they get. So the more you get out there, the better you are going to be too. So practice is key. But, you know, it can be fun, especially in certain months where it might be cold and there's not a lot of variety. You can have some fun with some of the common birds here, like this dark-eyed junco in the snow. I just shot it on my backyard deck. I had a little perch and it was in the middle of a snowstorm, and I really wanted to get some birds on the fresh snow with some snowflakes flying around, and he was kind enough to dip his bill in the snow and get some snowflakes on himself for me. And that was the shot I was hoping for that day. So it kind of added extra value to my common feeder birds. So this is the part that I know a lot of people are interested to discuss. There's a few different ways you can go about getting into gear. There's the DSLR, which is what I shoot. There's the cameras with the built-in lenses with the huge zooms on them. A little bit newer style of camera is the mirrorless, which Martha provided an image here that compares her 600 millimeter Nikon to the mirrorless camera she shoots now. So that will be a big difference in weight and performance too. And there are some differences that go along with mirrorless versus the DSLR. And we can talk about those in the Q&A if you'd like. But I recommend for most bird photography, you want to have a good size lens on there with 400 to 600 millimeter magnification if possible. You can go less than that, but you really are counting on either a large bird or large bird in close proximity or both. So you might not be able to come home with as many nice shots on like a typical day at McGee Marsh, for example, because the warblers could be foraging higher than your lens can reach. So I like to recommend somewhere in the 400 to 600 range, depending on how stable you are with your hand holding or how much vibration reduction is in your lens. You might need a tripod to get a sharp image. They're fun, especially if you're staked out like maybe a rookery or someplace where there's birds flying all over the place and you don't want to be hand holding for 5 hours. They can be useful, but they're less fun when you have to drag them on a trail or walk a long distance. So that's something you could look into as well. I always recommend having a small handful of extra memory cards, extra batteries, and something to process the image files with. So Photoshop or Lightroom are what's commonly used. I grew up on Photoshop, and it's there's a lot of tricks to save you time when you're processing images, and there's a lot of noise reduction software that can help you out too. So in this case, there was a limpkin foraging pretty close, had a tripod. He wasn't going anywhere. And I think I fired off 800 images, so the memory cards came in handy on this bird. But I kind of used a lot of that gear to capture this image, and I was able to let my daughter, who was 7 at the time, take some photos as well because of the stability of the tripod, and she didn't have to hold the heavy lens, and that can be a big advantage as well. So when you're selecting your camera, there's a lot to choose from. There's a lot of brands that offer similar things, and I think we got a pretty good mixture in the group. I'm a Nikon guy. I think Martha, I think, what was yours? Is yours Sony? I know Carol's Canon.
Panasonic.
You're Panasonic? Okay. And Diane, you're Canon, right? Well, anyway, I wouldn't say that necessarily any of them is better than the next for getting bird photos. It's more of a personal preference with me. I just started off with that camera. I was familiar with it, and all the lenses went together. So I kind of just kept going up the ladder with the cameras that I purchased based on the gear that I had. But as far, it's all just personal preference. I don't think there's any one that's better or worse necessarily. It's just what lenses mainly that you want to have. Do they have a lens that suits your shooting style that is in that brand of camera? So when you're looking at features, you probably want to look at what the image quality is going to be on it. Just Google the camera you're interested in. You can look at Flickr. for people that are shooting with the camera you think you might want, and see if the quality is up to par with your standards. I recommend looking into a camera and lens combo that has a really good autofocus, so that you're able to track birds in flight, moving birds in the canopy, and your camera's not struggling to autofocus. So if it's really lagging, you're going to get a lot of empty branch shots. But don't despair. You can always predict, learn to predict the behavior for the camera and get focused on where you think they're going to be and still get the shot. What I like to tell people is if you can get a shot of anything, you can get a shot of everything. It just, your keeper rate might be lower. But if you can go out and take a picture of a stick with a leaf on it and focus and it's sharp, then you can get a picture of a stick and a leaf that's sharp with a bird on it that's sharp. So don't get discouraged. It's a little bit trickier than that. And, but you can get there. It just might take a little bit more time if your autofocus is lagging. ISO is important too. So if you can have a camera body that handles ISO pretty well, you won't have a noisy image. You can shoot a faster shutter speed, which will give you a faster or a sharper image. Megapixels can be important depending on what you want to do with it. It basically, if you're not familiar with megapixels, it's how much resolution is in your image. So the more megapixels, the bigger you can print it or zoom in on it and get the details. So that's getting a little technical right off the bat. I don't want to get lost in those details. And then the final thing you might want to consider is how much the camera and the lens weighs. If you don't want to carry a heavy camera around, that's a big consideration for a lot of people. So like I was talking about with Martha, the mirrorless cameras are a lot lighter. And I believe the lenses too. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So this photo I took 8 years ago with my first camera and lens combo. And the reason I selected is, I still like the photo even eight years later, but it wasn't as expensive a setup as I have now. And I still probably couldn't have expected much better than this with what I have. So you can get images that you're happy with your entry-level gear. It's just a matter of finding a situation that really suits photography. In this case, we were in a blind 5 feet away from nesting puffins, and the light was in our favor, and the birds were not the least bit shy, and they were coming and feeding their chicks and giving us all these poses. And I had, I think, close to 1,300 images that were all just about like this with different poses and different behavior. So that is something to keep in mind, that even if you don't have several $1,000s worth of gear, you can still get an image that you're happy with. And I know reviewing my my portfolio, this is one to me that I still can go in and zoom in and not nitpick too much as far as the sharpness or the noise levels, and just it's one that I still like even 8 years later with a couple upgrades in gear. So when you're getting into bird photography, there's a couple things that you should know from like an ethical standpoint. Is that you always want to preserve the safety of your subject. Don't ever try to flush the bird, get it to fly, approach when you can tell it's nervous, those sort of things. I mean, I'm not going to say that I've never spooked a bird into flight. I think we've all done that, but never do it intentionally. Always keep in mind that you have to be a good steward of these animals, and getting the bird safety or safe is more important than the shot. That's why I tell people, if you scare the bird away, you didn't deserve the photo. And that's where you get a lot of those kind of prickly interactions between old school birders and photographers, because they don't think the photographers respect the safety of the subject or the birds, and it can get a little contentious at times. And some people they're just there for the photo, and they don't really care about the welfare of the bird. So if you really get into this full time, and I know everybody in the group thinks along these lines, but always make sure that you're thinking of the safety of the bird. And I mean, a lot of you guys were on that owl trip where the people are trespassing the stand right under a snowy owl out in Tuscola County. I was really disappointed to see that kind of stuff, and people get carried away with owls in particular, where they approach too closely, they stress the bird out, cause it to fly, expend energy that it doesn't need to. So that's kind of the number one rule of photography. Don't do anything that puts the bird at risk. So the other thing you can do is if there's a certain species that you're just captivated with and you really want to get a good photo of them, spend some time with them, go out and see how they're behaving on territory, see how their nesting habits, their feeding habits, get an idea for the routine. And the more you know about your group of birds, the better you're going to be equipped to find out where they're going to be, when they're going to be there, and then plan out your shot ahead of time. So if you know that you have, a nesting warbler that you like, you can listen for it on a trail, find out the general range of its territory, and then start kind of scouting out what perches it likes to sing from, what time of day they come out, when do they rest, when do they come back, are they more likely to feed after a rain, that sort of thing. And that's where you really get into the really nuanced shots that most people can't get, that'll separate you from the pack if you can do that. So if you can see that they're bringing food for the young through a certain patch of trees, to stay there, try to be as quiet and inconspicuous as possible. And you can get a lot of good shots. Birds will adapt to your presence in a lot of cases pretty readily if you're playing it cool and you don't act like a predator. So if you don't wave your arms around or stare at them or creep up on them, there's a lot of things you can do to be non-threatening, because most of the time you're not going to hide from these birds. They're going to know you're there. And the best thing you can do to make sure that you get a close look at them is, wander indirectly at them, maybe from the side, maybe moonwalk to them, which is one of my favorite moves. You walk backwards and just take a peek over your shoulder every once in a while and make sure that they're not getting stressed. Do that over the course of 20, 30 minutes. And then you can get yourself in a good position. Now, the one thing I will warn you, and I learned this the hard way this year, is that you have to also walk away very slowly as well. This photo was at Tawas Beach. We, myself and this other photographer, spent 20 minutes getting a good angle on this Whimbrel. And he had never photographed shorebirds before, and we were able to observe the behavior, get low, crawl up on them, and get a good look. And the photographer that I was with got bored and left and just got up and walked away, and it caused this bird to fly. So I was able to get a nice photo of him in flight, but it wouldn't have been my favorite thing to do because we caused the bird to fly when it didn't need to. And we would have been fine if we had just acted disinterested and non-threatening when we left. But when you get up and you're 6 feet tall, you're a big predator to a lot of these birds, and they're not going to stick around to find out if you're friendly. So photography is all about light. Light gives you the parameters for what you can do with your camera. So shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are your parameters that you get to capture the photo with. So you can always get a certain amount of light, and then you have to divide it up how you're going to share that quantity of light with these three features on your camera. So shutter speed is just that. It's how fast the camera opens and closes its shutters. So the faster your shutter speed is, the more motion gets frozen and the sharper your photo is going to be, generally speaking. That also has to do, you also have to consider for sharpness, depth of field, which is aperture, how much of the bird is in focus. So the bigger the number, the more stuff is going to be in focus. And they're defined by F/ and then the number. So example, the widest my aperture will open, so it's allowing the most light, but it also has the shallowest depth of field, is 5/6 on my lens. So if I'm really close to a bird and I have my 5.6 and it's letting the most light in as possible, well, the depth of field could be pretty narrow. So if I want to get more of the bird in focus, I'll have to stop down, close that aperture, which will result in maybe an f9, but more of the bird will be in focus. Now the trade-off for that is it doesn't let as much light in the camera. So you're going to have to take away from either shutter speed or raise your ISO. Now the payoff with ISO is that it'll be noisier. If you shot an old school camera, you know about film speed. So that's basically what ISO is. So if you have a higher ISO number, you're going to have more noise introduced to your file. Now that's where you're going to invest a lot of your money for gear. The more expensive cameras, generally speaking, can handle ISO better, so you can crank the ISO up without having as much of a negative effect on your image. But depending on what you're shooting, how much light, you can get away with a lower ISO on some of the lower end cameras and still get a nice image. So you're basically always trading off one for the other. And there's rarely a situation where you can have a low ISO, a big aperture, and a fast shutter speed. Just doesn't happen all that often unless you're in the middle of the day on a snowy day with, you know, white bird. You can sometimes get all those things lined up. So it's something you have to think about. What are the lighting conditions for a particular day? And what is your subject doing? If it's a stationary bird, you can slow down that shutter speed and still get a sharp image because the bird, maybe it's a snowy owl sitting on a phone pole in the winter. You don't need a lot of shutter speed to capture that. So you could open up or stop down your aperture, have more of the bird in focus, lower your ISO for a less noisy image, and use the light that way. So it just depends on what the subject is, and that's something that you'll learn from experience. So if you're shooting warblers or kinglets or something like that, if your shutter speed isn't fast enough, you're going to get a blurry image. So that should be your priority above the others, because if you don't have a sharp image, it's basically not worth taking the photo in most cases, unless you're trying for some artistic blurs or something. Shutter speed is sort of the gold standard for bird photography, in my opinion. The more of that you can get, and it's just up to you for what you're able to achieve with your camera. So, for example, my lens is able to soften the movement in my hand with something called image stabilization or vibration reduction, depending on what your camera company calls it. But basically it eliminates handshake. So I can stop down my shutter speed a little bit more with that lens than I could with my old one and get a sharp image still. So there's a lot that goes into it, but these are the three features that you have to keep in mind for your cameras. And again, it just depends. Like if you're in the early morning in winter and it's a really cloudy day, you're not going to have hardly any light. So your image quality is probably going to suffer, or your sharpness, or some combination of all those. You might have a bird that doesn't have a lot of depth of field with a slow shutter speed and a high ISO. And those are when you have to consider, like, maybe it wasn't the best day to go out shooting. And then you just enjoy the birds and not worry about getting the best image possible. So it's a lot of trade-offs to get what you want. And the more you practice, the more you can kind of know what your capabilities are with your gear. So this is a good example of what I'm talking about. This bird I took while there was a rainstorm coming in, and it brought all the birds down low, but it made the light really, really, really dim. So I couldn't use a big f-stop. I had to open it up as far as possible, so I didn't have a big depth of field. So if you notice, this bird's head is sharp, but the tail's blurry and the branches blurry and the feet are blurry. And the only thing that I was really worried about was getting that head in focus. And I had to use a slow shutter speed, 1/200th of a second. And my focal length was 420 millimeters. And I used an ISO of 800 because I didn't trust that my camera would handle noise well enough any higher than that. So it gives you an idea. I had to sacrifice some depth of field for this bird. but I was still pretty happy with the pose and having that slightly blurry image in most of the bird, because what I really wanted to focus on was the color in the head and the throat. Because, you know, if you look at the wing color of a palm warbler, it's not that exciting. So all the fun things on this bird are kind of in the head, which was in focus on this image. So when you know that you want a certain quality of light, there's some guidelines for that too. Golden hour is sort of what is preferred. It's not mandatory by any means, but if you can get a sunny day, first 2 hours and last 2 hours, it's usually the best quality of light you can get. The shadows are not super dark on the bird. It's not like crazy blown out bright either. And you can get some really nice looking photos if you can get a bird out in the open with that type of light. If you go in the middle of the day, generally speaking, you have more quantity of light, but it's also at its harshest. So your birds are going to have really bright highlights and really dark shadows. You know, if that doesn't bother you, which it bothers me more now than it did when I was starting out. I was looking for all the shutter speed I could get, so I would shoot on the sunniest day in the middle of the day with as much light as I could to get just the sharpest image possible. But now I'm kind of, I really want to focus on the quality of light. I don't want things to be too blown out. I don't want it to be too contrasty. The other thing that you can do if you want to shoot in the middle of the day is look at an overcast day. It's a little bit tricky to shoot on a cloudy day, but I find that if you can avoid shooting up into the sky, you can get some good stuff on an overcast day, especially in the woods. So for warblers and songbirds, it's really it can be good to shoot on a cloudy day because you don't have to worry about the harsh highlights at midday. But you're going to have to lower your shutter speed to get a little bit more light into your camera. But you know, the trade-off is you don't have as much color. So if you're shooting at the water, it's often white or gray. If you're shooting at the sky, it's white or gray. So you have to really pay attention to what your backgrounds are for your bird if you're shooting on a cloudy day. But a lot of my favorite photos are in the forest on a cloudy day. So the cover image of that blue-gray gnatcatcher, same kind of conditions. It was during a rainstorm, but the leaves were kind of had a wet reflective quality too, so the greens really pop in that situation. So I was able to get a nice smooth green background, and then the palm warbler was the same situation. If you can get it, really good light is when there's a thin veil of clouds on a sunny day, and you know, a really humid day, sometimes you get that, and it gives you this soft, buttery, but bright light that fills in the shadows, but it really gives you a lot of light to play with, so you can usually get a wider depth of field and a faster shutter speed. And there's a lot of options there, but you don't get it too often. So if you're out shooting and you have that situation, then take advantage of it because it's nice. This is an example of a bird taken during golden hour. It's a ruddy turnstone, and this was about half an hour before sunset. And there was not a lot of light, but there was enough for me to get 1/2500th of a second on my shutter speed. So even at that, you can see that the toe that's in the air is still a little blurry. That's how fast they move when they're scurrying around. But the head was sharp and a lot of the feather details there because I was able to shoot at such a fast shutter speed. And you can see that there's not a lot of harsh shadows on this bird. You get kind of that nice yellow light on the breast and the face. And yeah, it's just a really nice time to be out. Very relaxing at those hours too. When you kind of begin or end the day with the bird, it's kind of a special experience too. So when you're going to turn the dial on top of your camera, there's a couple of modes that you'll see. Every camera is different, but there's a couple that are pretty typical on all of them, and I don't tend to deviate from these three. First one is aperture priority. So you set the aperture of your lens, and the camera will make adjustments to your shutter speed based on how much light there is. So if you're shooting into some bright, into a brightly lit subject, and your aperture is wide open, you're going to get a lot of shutter speed. And that can be a good thing too. But you're leaving the camera to make those decisions for you. Shutter priorities, the other yin to the yang of the aperture priorities. So you're talking about the aperture going in and out, adjusting onto the available light. Generally speaking, in most cameras, I think you kind of pick the ISO as well, and then it only moves one thing up and down as you're going from light condition to light condition. For me, I really prefer shooting manual, where you just set everything and you have to update your shutter speed and your aperture depending on how much light is available to get the right exposure. I think if you shoot on the other modes, you can kind of get a little lazy and you can end up with exposures that aren't suited for the situation. So what I run into a lot is if you have an auto mode and you're shooting at a bird with a bright background, it'll expose for the background and you'll get a silhouetted bird with no detail. It'll be too dark. And it's because the camera is sampling light from the bird and the sky, and it's trying to make a value on that. And you'll end up with photos that are not usable. A lot of times, if you don't really dial in your settings, you still have to mess with things in that situation. So if you know you're going to be birding with the camera and shooting at warblers up in the canopy and you use an auto mode, you're probably just going to get bird silhouettes because it's trying to not overexpose the sky. And that's why I like to use manual mode. You kind of take a picture and see how it looks and if the tree branch or the bird is exposed correctly. And I'm not really worried about what the sky is doing because I'm not taking a picture of the sky. I'm taking a picture of the bird. So when you're composing, there's a couple guidelines, and I'm going to go over it real briefly here. There's a lot that you can get into with composition, and it's going to be up to you what you like. But there's a couple of things that are kind of intuitive that people use, and it can kind of give you a baseline to go off of. And then if you want to make tweaks to it, you go from there. So first one is rule of thirds. Now it's divided up into three quadrants vertically and three quadrants horizontally, and where the lines intersect here are your focal points. You want to put something important there. So a lot of times you want to make sure the head or the eye or something is near one of these points. Here I kind of put the peak of the head there because of the way the position of the photo was. A lot of times you might want to put the eye of the bird there. It kind of keeps, what it does is it keeps you from centering things. You don't want to just plop the bird in the dead center of every photograph every time. This one's pretty well centered, but not completely. And the reason why you do that is you want to give the bird room to breathe. So you usually want to have more room ahead of the bird than you have behind it. You're giving it room to move into, metaphorically speaking. As you see, the bird's probably swimming from right to left. You don't want it to hit its head on the edge of the photo. Same way you don't want it to hit its head on the top of the photo either, so you give it some breathing room around there. It's just a rule of thumb that I like to do when I'm cropping my photos. Give the bird more room ahead of it than behind it. Especially in photos where the movement is implied. So if you're talking about flight, swimming, the bird's actively looks like it's streamlined in one direction, it's really important to make sure you give that bird room to move into mentally for the viewer, because otherwise they're going to feel like the bird's kind of trapped and claustrophobic. So that's a couple of things when you're composing your photo to keep in mind. The thing I will talk about as far as getting a nice background is selecting a good angle for your subject. And that means getting eye level. If you guys have been out with me shorebirding, you know I like to crawl around in the sand and get real low with my camera. And the reason for that is if you're eye level with the subject, especially with a bird that's low, you're going to have a lot more subject isolation because the background's going to be further away, and you're not going to be confused with all the leaf and detail, pop leaves and dirt and waves and everything behind it. It'll soften out. I'll show you an example on the next slide, because it allows you to get that space between the subject and the background, and it blurs out the foreground as well. The other thing to keep in mind is the angle of the light. You always want to keep the light behind you unless you're deliberately aiming for a side lit or backlit image. So the way I've heard is basically you can point your shadow at the bird and then kind of go maybe an arm's width on either side as a rule of thumb. I don't really worry about it too much if the situation is good, but I can't adjust where I'm standing. I'll just take the photo and accept the consequences. But if you're able to move and get kind of squared with the angle of the sun, especially during golden hour when the sun's lower, it can get you a really nice look to your bird, and you don't have harsh shadows, or you're not shooting into the sun, blowing your retinas out by staring at a lens. And it gives you a nice catch light in the eye, which is important to give your subject life. If you have the no catch light in the eye, the bird kind of looks dead or not real because the eye is not glistening. It's a trick to really add life to your photos. So this is an example of if you're at a high angle with a low bird, you're shooting down at it, this stuff here right behind the bird is going to be in focus. So there could be like a Mountain Dew bottle behind this sandpiper, you know, some dirt, mud, algae, something that you don't really like to see in the photo. But it'll all be in focus because that's not too far from the bird. That's going to be really distracting. You get low with the bird, that is not in focus anymore, because your background's way back here, and this is only going to be in focus right in here. So this is a good example of this. This is a semi-palmated plover. I was laying in the sand, and see how the only thing in focus really is the bird and the sand that's right where he's standing. None of this is in focus. You couldn't see the trash on the beach or anything that was back here. I think this wasn't in this case. It's a pretty clean beach, but I've had shorebirds where they're just in really gross looking situations where if you get low to them, it looks like they're standing on a cloud, and it's a much nicer look. Also gets you to sort of engage with this bird because he's looking right at you. You're not, you know, towering over him, and he's not towering over you. You're sort of on the same level. And it gives you an intimacy with the bird that you wouldn't have otherwise. Big way this shows up is with waterfowl. If you were shooting down at this bird, the detail in the waves gets really distracting. If you have a whole background that has this much detail, it takes away from the bird. By getting low, you get all the nice blue color from the water, but you're not getting all these distracting ripples and reflections here. So it's harder to do because a lot of times there's an embankment down to the water level, but if you're able to either shoot from the water line or in the water a little bit, you can get some really nice images. And this is what really separates ducks, like a nice duck photo from like a run-of-the-mill photo. If the sharpness is the same, this angle right here, it makes the world of difference, and it's really nice and satisfying when you can get it. So when you're exposing for a bird, there'll be a meter on the viewfinder of your camera when you're looking through that generally will have a middle point with a line, and then if you're over or underexposed, it'll have lines to the left is underexposed, to the right is overexposed. If you're right on exposure, it's going to be generally in the center. There's a couple caveats with that, is that your camera meter will expose to try to make the brightest color like a medium gray. So if you want the white in your scene to be perfectly white, you're going to want to overexpose purposely. Manual focus or manual control on your exposure mode is key for that, or you can do exposure compensation on your other modes where you basically say, okay, I want this scene to be brighter or darker than what my meter thinks it should be. So depending on if you're shooting a scene that only has one bright thing, or everything's bright, you can adjust for that, but you're going to have to do some trial and error to see how it works with your camera setup. When you look at it, is it really giving you an accurate description of the light and the detail of the subject? Is it what you saw, or is it, you know, too dark or too light? And you don't want to have anything that's really bright highlights or really dark shadows. And you know, the more detail you can reveal in your photo, feathers, beak, leg detail, that sort of thing, that'll give you the idea. If they're obscured by your exposure, you're probably not exposing right. So you might want to look into either, you know, giving yourself a brighter exposure or taking that down if it's too bright. So here's an example of a well-exposed photo and an overexposed photo. This is up here is called a histogram, and it's a visual representation of the information in each photo. And the highlights are on the right, and the shadows are on the left. So this has a high amount of shadows here, and a lot of midtones, and only a little bit of really bright colors in this image. Now, if you look over here, I overexposed this one purposely, and you see all this right here. That means that the highlight is blown out. It's overexposed because everything's bunched up on the right side of this. Now, if you touch this right side or this left side, it's basically deleting information from your image, and you won't be able to recover it. If it's anywhere in between, you usually, in post-processing, can recover details in there. It's not lost. So if you can avoid that on your histogram, which is usually a mode that you can view when you're previewing it on the back of your camera, you can view the histogram there, and it'll give you an idea of, okay, did I overexpose that? Because if your whites are just shy of this, that's perfect most of the time. And if they're sort of evenly dispersed here, that's pretty good. You know, I probably would have gone maybe a touch more brighter exposure on this one based on that to get a little bit closer to this right edge, but that's personal preference. But I just wanted to show you what happens when you overexpose, because generally speaking, the software is so good that if you shoot in RAW format instead of JPEG, which we can talk about in a different class that's a little bit more technical, the Photoshop and Lightroom will recover a lot of detail. If you mess up your exposure, you can brighten it or darken it and still recover detail, and it's not necessarily lost. But here, these bright white highlighted areas here, they're going to be gone. There's not going to be any saving them if you expose that far over. So that'll bring us to the end of session 1 for this. I just wanted to kind of get your questions and comments about what you want to learn about. I know gear discussion is pretty important, but aside from that, you know, what other questions do you have? Is there anything that is intimidating to you that you don't understand that you want to learn more about before taking the plunge into that, or any specific questions that you might have? I'm going to unmute everybody. Hold on here. Okay.
Nice presentation, Joe.
Yes, thank you, Joe.
Yeah,
Very
thank
good.
you.
Answered a lot of my questions already.
Yeah, it's a subject that honestly we could probably spend weeks and weeks talking about. I just wanted to kind of get an intro of some of the basics that I found most helpful. But when we can get into specifics, and I'm going to put together a couple of these that can deal with questions that you might have. And you don't have to think of everything now, but if there's stuff, I wanted to be able to tailor these presentations to what everybody's dealing with, and problems that they've had in the past shooting, or sort of obstacles that they want to overcome to get going. Because honestly, it brings a level of enjoyment to birding that I can't even really fully explain. It's great. Not the only thing, obviously. There's a lot of other fun things that we that we do. But having a nice photo, it's like getting that souvenir from a great birding experience. So does anybody have any questions? Anybody at all?
Oh, Joe, I have a question.
Go
Can you
ahead.
hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I think was it Martha that shoots mirrorless?
Yeah.
Okay, would you mind if I asked her something?
Is she still here?
If she's still there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Oh, hey Martha, it's Diane. Hey, on your mirrorless, you know, I'm looking into the new Canon mirrorless. Oh my gosh, I was reading for hours and hours this weekend. But do you find yourself using the electronic shutter, or does yours also have a mechanical shutter?
I use shutter mainly because I was reading in the manual that it can distort a moving subject, and since birds often move even when you think you're, you know, you're taking a still,
Yeah.
still subject, I just didn't want to risk it, so I just used the mechanical.
Mechanical. I heard that if you're using the electronic shutter, that you can actually what you see through the viewfinder is actually your exposure, which is kind of interesting, you know. Instead of having to do a depth of preview or something.
Yeah,
So say
that's an excellent
once
point.
you set your f-stop in your. Anyways, I know it's complicated, but I had to ask her since she was here.
Well, yeah, that was one of the key things I wanted to bring Martha on to talk about, because I don't have any experience with the mirrorless, and I know that's what she's been shooting. So,
Joe, I float my ISO too. Do you do that? Do you ever do that? Can you do that on your Nikon?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't.
I usually shoot in manual and then float my ISO.
Yeah.
Yeah, I keep everything pretty much fixed, and then I usually just adjust my shutter when I'm out there. I usually try to keep my ISO as low as I can, because my D500 doesn't handle noise particularly well. I can only shoot up to about 1250 where I'm happy.
Mm-hmm.
I just bought some noise reduction software that I was I know I was bugging Carol.
The Topaz? Did you get the Topaz?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
And I really like that. But I still kind of keep it in the 800 to 1,000 range, because it just starts taking quality too much when I go too much above that. But fall warblers, whew, it's dark in there. So anybody else have any questions? I know we were talking about gear. If anybody has any questions about that you want to talk about.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes.
Being that I'm very new to this and just got a new camera, I've been trying to get most of the bird to fill the frame. When you take a picture, do you take the picture from further away and then crop it? Because even when I'm trying to fill the frame, I lose the bird a lot of times.
Yeah. It really happens where I get so close that I'm completely filling the frame with the bird. It's usually good to keep a little bit of room on either side so you can compose it well. You don't want it too tight to the edge. So you want it as close as you can in frame, but if you could err on the side of giving it a little bit too much room and then cropping in, that's probably the way I would do it.
Okay, thank you.
But a lot of it is so much of it is subjective. What are you happy with? If you don't have to be at the mercy of any other photographer, award committee or anything. So whatever it makes you happy, that's the key thing that people got to keep in mind. Whatever your standard is for enjoyment, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about what everybody else is doing, because I know it gets pretty competitive with photographers, and then That's why I prefer hanging out with birders, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you.
I have a question about the software that you mentioned.
Yes.
You talked about Photoshop, which I'm kind of familiar with, but I've never heard of Lightroom. What is the difference? What is the good and the evil between the two?
Oh.
Oh, a lot.
I think a lot of people use both of them. Lightroom is better for handling multiple files, and it has a lot of the same features where you can kind of process a bunch of photos at once and tag them, adjust exposure, reduce noise. There's a lot of different features that you can do in both. I think people generally will say, they picked out 100 photos from their trip, and they can process them and then go in and remove details that they didn't like in Photoshop. There's a weird stick or something in the background. They go clone that out in Photoshop. But they did all their post-processing for the most part, exposure and noise reduction. They did it in Lightroom. They work hand in hand, and if you buy the software, or rent the software, it's like a monthly subscription. You can get both through Adobe. And for me, I just use Photoshop for everything. I didn't, I wasn't raised in Lightroom, although I'd like to learn a little bit more about it. For me, I just use Photoshop to process my photos because it has a lot of the same functionality.
Okay.
But yeah, I think if that's something that everybody would like, we can do Photoshop tutorial or a Lightroom tutorial as well. That's something I kind of was thinking for later on. If that's interesting to enough people, we could put that together. I was doing Photoshop before I even had a camera for work. So
Okay.
half my day is spent in Adobe programs. So going over and a lot of it is if you're shooting a lot and you want to do things quickly, that's where it really comes in handy, having quick ways of doing things that you're, being repetitive. If you're doing the same tweaks to this, the same type of photo over and over again, it'll save you time, and you want to get through the busy work as fast as possible and focus on the fun stuff.
Okay.
Anybody else? Well,
Just want to say thanks.
what's that?
Just want to say thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I've been putting this together for a long time, but life kind of got in the way a little bit. This year is a little bit strange, if you haven't noticed. But if you guys want to either message me or maybe comment on the thread later if you think of something else that you would like me to cover, I'm going to go into a little bit more specific things. But I really what I would have liked to have done would have been to have this and then go out on like a Saturday morning and have like a hands-on workshop, which obviously is not going to be the best thing for this year. But if people are still interested in that, hopefully once this whole virus thing is over, if there's still a world left after that, I'd be happy to take you guys out and we could meet up somewhere where we know they're going to be good subjects. Like I said, Kensington was kind of where I started. Shooting those sandhill cranes is a great place to start. A nice big cooperative subject that's fun to look at, and it's easier to explain things if you're not getting the results you want when you're able to do it in real time. But I just wanted to kind of encourage people, like, if this is something that you think is going to interest you, there's nothing that's stopping you from being really, really good at it. So I don't find it to be, like I said, a special like gift or skill or something that you can't be taught or learned on your own even. There's plenty of materials out there that you can look up on YouTube or get a little online class or ask somebody in the group to tell you how to ins and outs of things. So I just wanted to be as encouraging as possible because it's a lot of fun, and you can get as involved with it as you want or casual as you want with it and still get a lot out of it. So please send me your questions as you come up with them, and then it'll help me put together the content for the next one if people want to hear some more about photography, because it's sure fun talking about it. And frankly, it's good to see you guys. It's kind of weird being stuck at home all summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, very
Agreed.
weird.
Thank you very much. This was really helpful.
All right. Well, just get a hold of me and let me know what you think, and we'll catch up later. Bye, everybody.
Good
Thanks.
seeing you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.